So today we're going to focus on MongoDB. There are many different database technologies that can be used with web apps. We use MongoDB because it's very popular, it's very flexible, it has a very shallow learning curve, but then it gets like super steep. But for what we need, it's very straightforward. Um, it's free. There's all sorts of advantages for us. Some other very popular databases you may have heard of are SQL, pronounced SQL, and MySQL is one particular implementation of SQL. That's very popular. Steeper learning curve, somewhat old, like it's been around for a lot longer, which has advantages and disadvantages. But we're going to focus on MongoDB because it's like really straightforward. Um, SQL is a like a structured database where you define in advance the structure and relationships of all your data, and that can be very powerful from a design perspective. MongoDB is what's called a document database. You don't define any of the structure up front. So it's very flexible and it can scale really well. It's got some powerful querying and indexing features, which we're not going to use, but they're there for like more um, larger scale applications. Here's some terms that we're going to use and that you're going to see in the code we write and you're going to see when we look at stuff in MongoDB. Um, a we're going to like be using a database. So if I have time, I will show you like how to create or like how I created the database we're using. A database contains what are called collections. Okay, that's a MongoDB term. A collection is simply a bunch of different documents. The data we write to the database and the data we read from a database all comes from a document. Okay. So you can think database is the big thing. We have one database that we're going to be using for the rest of the semester. It has different collections. So for example, we're going to use one collection today. We're going to use a different collection for the lab practical. We're going to use a different collection for our summative lab at near the end of the unit. And then a collection has one or more documents, and we'll see what that looks like as well. Okay, so that's the terminology part of it. The documents in MongoDB are very similar to JSON objects, which is really nice. Like you can open up the document through the web interface and actually see the data in the document, and it looks like JSON. What's really cool is that we will be using a node module that automatically, when it pulls in the data from the MongoDB document, it converts it into a JavaScript object. Super convenient. One thing that's important is that every document has an underscore ID field, which is like the unique identifier for that document. It's like the primary key that's used for like indexing and searching. We don't really need to worry about that. If we need it, it's there. And if we don't need it, it's generated automatically. I just want you to be aware such a thing exists. So when you're browsing the document in like through the web interface, you're like, what is this underscore ID thing? I didn't make that. Yeah, it was generated automatically, but it's important. Don't get rid of it. All right, let's try this out a little bit. What I want to show you first is we have a file in our project here called package.json. And what package.json is, and we'll use this extensively when we start doing our Node web server, but package.json specifies here's like other what we call modules that we want to use with Node to do more powerful things. Okay, we haven't worried about this yet. This is similar to like including like jar files for Java or modules for Python, similar concept. So I've already created this file for us for this part of the unit. You have like, and the modules are organized into like dependencies. So there's other stuff that goes into package.json. We'll get to that later. But for now, we're just focused on dependencies. There are two we're using today, and they're already here. One is called .env. We'll talk about that in a moment. And one is the module for interacting with MongoDB itself. And so that is specified as well. So it specifies both the name of the dependency, and the way I'm formatting this is like the minimum version number. So we need at least version 5.6. A later version would be okay. We also have dev dependencies. These are all related to ESLint. ESLint is the tool we're using. It's a linter. A linter is a tool that looks at your code and makes suggestions about things that might not be technically wrong, like it's going to crash or throw an exception, but it's not best practice. We also have some additional dependencies here for the linter that formats everything. Know how when we save stuff, it reformats it so it looks like standard. That's what those dependencies are for. It's important that we have this stuff in the package.json file, but simply specifying this doesn't actually install the modules. Every time we add a new module, or every time we start with a new project in VS Code, we have to explicitly install the module. So we're going to do that together now. We need a terminal window. So if you go up to the terminal menu and choose new terminal, it gives you a terminal window here. The command we use for all of this is npm. npm is an acronym for the Node Package Manager. It's the tool that manages all the Node packages. You can do a lot of stuff with npm. All we ever do with npm is we say, almost all we ever do is we say npm install. So npm space install. You can abbreviate that as npm space I, and then you hit return, and it looks at the package.json and it will install everything you need. I already have everything installed. So like that's why it was really fast for me. But you should see that it installs the MongoDB and the .env modules. Okay. You might see some things about vulnerabilities and stuff. I have 2 moderate vulnerabilities and 3 high. I'm not sure what you'll have. We're not going to worry about that here. We're not going to go to like a production server. No one's going to try to hack our live coding today. So we're not going to worry about that right now. But NPM does make it easy to fix those vulnerabilities and update. Great question. It's kind of built into the way Node works. So there are ways to globally install stuff with npm, much like you could with like pip with Python. But by default, this is installing everything locally. And in fact, you'll notice there's a folder now called node underscore modules, which is all the modules for this project. So it's really easy to have multiple projects with different versions and different modules, and they all stay separate. So I'd say it's a slightly cleaner approach than Python, but it's very, very similar. All right, so now we have the things we need, which is great. The .env module is really important because it allows us to create a file that doesn't get committed to GitHub that can contain all of the secrets for our web application. So we need to actually specify like the username and password for the MongoDB database. We would never want to put that in code and then commit it and push it to GitHub, because then other people could use that and access our database, and that would be problematic, right? GitHub has tools that constantly scan repositories and often detect when we accidentally do that, but it's a real pain when we accidentally do that, because then we have to like shut down the database, change the password, update the credentials of everything, right? So we never want to commit this stuff, any type of like secrets, to GitHub. Instead, we put it all in a .env file, which is local. So we're going to create that together now. On the top of our file explorer here, if you hover at the top, there's a little icon with the file and the plus symbol. This will create a new file, and we're going to call it .env. And when you do that, you'll notice it's grayed out, just like Node modules is grayed out. This is because I've configured this GitHub repository to ignore everything in Node modules and to ignore .env. So as I start typing stuff in here, it's not going to show up as anything that's been changed, okay? Because we don't want to commit it, right? The whole point is this is where we can put our passwords, and it stays locally on our computer and never gets committed and uploaded to github.com. Okay. So what goes in .env? Um, right now, we're going to put our connection string. We're going to put our connection string. So I'm going to stop recording for a second. All right, so now we've configured our .env file with our connection string, which includes the username and password for our Mongo database. Cool, so now let's do something interesting with the database. So I'm gonna click on db.js. It's over here in our file explorer. And we're gonna explore like the most basic features of Mongo today. Um, and there's so much more you can do with it, but this gets us like 95% of the way there for anything you're going to need next semester. So um, we need to actually get a reference to an object we can use to talk to the database, and that's we usually call that the Mongo client. So I'm going to create a variable, and it's going to look a little bit different. I'm going to explain the syntax in a second. So I'm going to say Mongo client in curly brackets, and then I'm going to say require MongoDB. We're going to get a warning here about we can convert this to a ES module thing, but we're not going to do that right now. We're not going to worry about that. We're just going to write some Mongo code. So don't worry about that particular warning. We haven't seen this syntax before. A couple of things we haven't seen before. We haven't seen the require function before. The require function is how we basically pull in code from another JavaScript file or from a node module into this JavaScript file. Okay. So we're basically like pulling in this MongoDB thing. This is analogous to doing like an import in Java, right? So like we have to import, java.util.arraylist or whatever, same thing. This syntax, so when we use require here, the MongoDB node module um, actually returns several things like inside of an object. So it returns multiple stuff. We only care about the first thing that it returns, which is a reference to this client object. So this syntax here, by putting it in a curly bracket, is just a shortcut way of saying, yeah, this returns a bunch of stuff. Just assign the first thing in the object to this variable Mongo client, and then I can use the Mongo client. Otherwise, we'd have to like assign it to a variable like, I don't know, Mongo stuff. And then we do Mongo stuff dot, and there's a bunch of different stuff here. But I'd want to choose like, I forget which one it is. I can't remember, but I'd have to do something specific here and assign that to a different variable. We don't want to do any of that. We just care about the client. Super easy. All right, so now we've got our client. Now what we're going to do is we're going to load the environment variables. We're going to load that connection string with the username and password. So load environment variables from .env file into what's called process.env. We don't need that detail. We'll just say that. Here's how we do it. We create a reference to .env, and we're going to do another require here, and we're going to require that .env module. You'll notice that the things we're putting in the require statement here are exactly the things we put in our dependencies here, right? That's why we added these in dependencies so that we could require them, bring them into this JavaScript file. And then I can say .env.config. There's a config function on the .env object, and I need to pass it an object with various parameters. The one that we care about is the path to our .env file. And our .env file is at the root level of this project, right? At the same level as all these other files. So we just say .env, and that's it. Well, maybe I will say into process.env. Makes the next line make more sense. All right, so now we've required all the known modules we've needed. We've read in the connection string, or we've read in all of the environment variables from .env. So now we can actually create a new Mongo client. Okay, so this gives us like a reference to like the class. So we can say const client equals, I want a new Mongo client. Great. Where are we connecting to? Inside of process.env, I can say Mongo URI. This Mongo URI is what we put in our .env file, right? It was Mongo URI equals, and then that whole connection string with the username and password. So this is how we create a new client. All right, let's just do a little bit more to get to a good breaking point. We've only got a couple minutes left. We're going to write a function here that we're going to run asynchronously. We're going to talk more about asynchronously tomorrow. So I'm just going to say async function run. I'm naming my function run. I'm marking it as asynchronous. That's a topic for tomorrow. Um, the MongoDB functions we're going to call could throw exceptions. So we need to wrap all of this in a try block, like a try catch block, just like we would do in Java. Okay, very similar. And we're going to try to connect to the database. Connecting to the database takes some time. It's done asynchronously. So we're going to say await client connect like that. We're going to pause and talk a little bit about async await. I don't want to rush through the next few lines. And then we'll finish this up tomorrow. So when we label a function with the async keyword, we're saying that this function, what this function returns is a promise that it will eventually do what you said and give you the answer, but it doesn't do it right away. Okay. Why is that useful? Because if we're writing a web application, we don't want our web application, we don't want our server to freeze while it waits for a database to do some like time intensive operation. Okay. So instead we return a promise. We can keep doing other stuff that we want. If in fact we do want to wait, then we put the await keyword in front of the function we're invoking. So client.connect, the connect function on a Mongo client is an async function. It returns a promise to connect. It doesn't actually immediately connect. If we put the await keyword in front, it says, okay, I know you return a promise. Wait until that promise is resolved, meaning the connection was actually made, before we go on to the next line of code. So we're always in control of, do we want to wait for these asynchronous functions to actually fulfill their promise, or do we want to keep on going? But the idea that functions return promises and maybe not the results we expect is, in my opinion, the most confusing thing we're going to struggle with over the next couple of weeks. Okay. So I wanted to introduce a little bit of this idea of async and await. Tomorrow at the start of class, we're going to start with that concept as well to kind of hit it again. And then we're going to write more code to actually see how this is useful and how we navigate it. But this is actually a good place to stop for today.